So from 1989 to 93, I was Russ Mawby's executive assistant. So, and in that role was involved in starting what was then Michigan Nonprofit Forum, his work at Council of Michigan Foundations, and really the starting of the commission, which was bubbling up toward the end of that tenure. So then it became the second director of Michigan Nonprofit Forum, which became Michigan Nonprofit Association. Ended up testifying for CMF and others about the Community Foundation tax credit, involved in the CMF Public Policy Committee in that role. And then on the board of CMF, I chaired the advisory committee for the Office of Foundation Liaison, the governor's office, and Public Policy Committee and all the Washington trips, and chaired the conference 1 year. And then at the commission, no formal role, but the Volunteer Centers of Michigan, which were merged with Michigan Nonprofit Association, had a formal relationship with the commission. And so we were constantly connected as key partners. I think when you look at the organization around the nonprofits and philanthropy, we didn't forget how to have supper together. That a lot of the things that were creative and continue to be created were done because people could sit around a table and have a conversation about how to work together, what common visions were. And in many respects, we rode a set of small momentums to a common vision, then to inclusion. And typically, when you look at the world, we tend to try to do that backwards. Inclusion, vision, and then we get to the issue of trying to make momentum. And we didn't forget how to have supper together. We didn't forget how to informally relate to each other, and that made a huge difference. And I think because of that, the organizational structures continue to be in place to permit needed activities, but there's still a lot of organic pieces that continue to grow, and it allows us to focus and be nimble in ways that if we weren't having dinner together, we couldn't be. When I look at what Michigan has as a heritage, and CMF and M&A and the Commission and the Johnson Center, none of it would have happened without both Russ Mawby and Dottie Johnson. That their vision for this, they were the people that convened the dinner meetings. They were the people that had supper. They were the folks concerned about the greater good, not building something for the purpose of building it. And every one of those components, all four of them were not focused on single issues, but focused on how to uniquely serve Michigan. And without the two of them driving, it doesn't happen. Funding, leadership, bringing people to the table, making sure we could continue to meet and grow, that happened because of Russ and Dottie. I've had three great mentors that changed my life, and Russ is one of them. I went in a very green, young 20-something, and in the process of traveling with Russ and watching him in meetings, I learned I couldn't look at any single issue from one side, that every issue had multiple sides. I also learned that there was no one solution to any problem, which I think when you look at the weaknesses of institutions, that's what they do. Well, it's this way. We have to solve it this way. Instead, it's dozens of solutions, and you have to embrace them all until the market and the structure can determine which ones will work en route. I learned that from Russ. I learned you focused on people first. Don't bet on institutions, bet on people. And so when you go back and look at CMF and M&A and the Commission and the Johnson Center, it was the leadership that made them all work because it was focused on the people. I could go on for days about what I learned from Russ. From Dottie, it was, I always say Dottie had this incredible ability to have a firm grip with a velvet glove, that she absolutely saw what she needed to get, and along the way she would make sure everybody owned it and felt like it was theirs, and they felt stroked and valued, and she was able to move mountains by being aggressive. At the same time, she brought people along. You get caught up in Dottie's wake, and you were going to work to make everything happen. It was a tremendous style, and one that valued everybody and everything.
From your point of view.
So Russ was looking at the work of CMF, and he looked at the nonprofit sector in Michigan and said that we don't have a common place to come together, that the sector was essentially becoming siloed. Human services was different from healthcare, was different from higher education, was different than fill in the blank, the arts, etc. So he wanted to create a place where all of the sector could gather, with common issues and make sure those issues were pursued with common solutions. So he called together a group of associations from K-12 all the way through the arts and everything in between. And they sat together for about 9 months off and on and agreed that they needed to start something. And the Michigan Nonprofit Forum was born as a roundtable. This is another great example of how having the table works. Russ knew exactly what we needed when he called them together, but he let them discover it over the 9-month period. And so the forum originally was focused to be more of a think tank and to look at issues of research and how the sector would grow. And in time, it was found it had to be more pragmatic. So it morphed from this group of associations to being a membership organization with permanent seats and then some at-large seats, with a focus on public policy and on the important issues of the sector. It then merged with the Volunteer Centers of Michigan and Michigan Campus Compact, two extremely important institutions for service, and as a result of that, took on the whole service arm as part of their work. So that was all in my time frame, and then Sam Singh picked up the gavel and had a very heavy public policy focus, and a couple more mergers took place. And then Kyle Caldwell came in after that and has continued just to drive it forward. No, that was Sam.
It was Sam. Okay.
Sam and Kyle.
Okay.
Actually, Sam and Kyle together raised the money in the endowment,
Okay.
which some of us said, it'll never happen. And they were able to pull it off.
Yeah, how did it happen?
It happened because Governor Engler had an understanding of the importance of service, and Michelle Engler was head of the Community Service Commission, and if Governor Engler didn't have an understanding of service, I think Michelle was going to make him have an understanding of service. But they were very committed. The Community Service Commission was founded before we had a national structure. So the governor had put this instrument in place before there was a national movement for it. He was ahead of the curve. He understood that citizens had to engage. And one of the other great mentors of the three I mentioned was George Romney, who, when the commission was being formed, was bending the governor's ear on the need for service, and then he connected the volunteer centers very firmly into the commission and to M&A. Romney was the driver of citizen action, being an important element that we were losing as part of the Michigan Society. Dottie and Russ both have a unique set of abilities to empower everyone around them. And as a result of that, they didn't need to be strong in the use of power in any way. People would feel valued and empowered and included. They both have incredible integrity. So there was never a moment where you thought there was anything less than a transparent discussion. I have not known a lot of people who knew Russ, have known Russ or known Dottie, that would say they wouldn't run through a wall for them for that very reason. You knew what they represented was the right thing, and that there was great integrity, and that and they didn't care who got the credit. That was the whole other thing. They gave credit to everyone, and as a result of that, they were extremely effective. I don't think I remember in my 3 years plus working for Russ of him ever actually playing a strong-handed role. He would set direction, and he would sometimes lead by backing up. He would have the tension push against him and just simply turn around the other way by explaining direction and lightly moving people. It was, and Dottie, the same thing. Brilliant leaders. Yeah, CMF, there's no question it's been effective, and you can make a list of reasons for that, from the whole youth and philanthropy movement, the community foundation tax credit that got put in place, increase in giving, the growth in the community foundation sector that happened in that time frame. The numbers would show that it's successful. Why it was successful, again, back to Dottie and Russ. I mean, it was leadership. It was folks knowing that they were behind the right issues because those two people were behind those issues. Russ provided a sense of support and some capital early on, and then the other foundations followed suit. And Dottie was very persuasive at keeping a number of funders at the table. She worked a network better than anyone I've ever seen. If she could work a room, make all the rounds, and on the way out, people would almost be dropping checks in the hat as a result of Dottie explaining where they were and what was needed and making them feel part of the solution. They had Dottie and Russ had personal conversations with everyone. You always felt like the most valued person in the room when you were with Dottie or Russ. I think there are some issues that we haven't overcome, and it's unfortunately a lot of it's driven by some issues that separate the sector a bit. So community foundations have different needs than private foundations, than family foundations. And so sometimes we segment ourselves away and forget those common elements. CMF as a membership institution has this interesting balance of needing to serve the most needy that in their realm of members that pay the least amount of dues. So the 80-20 rule in reverse. 80% of your resources are going into 20% of the marketplace. And then the big funders need them the least, but have to support it. So it's a delicate balance. And there were times I worried that could come undone with the wrong change in players among the big foundations or in some family foundation or community foundation leadership. It's still held together. I think if we try to structure it differently, it will fail. And it's just going to be, for the history of CMF, always about that balance. It's transference of leadership's a tough issue. I don't think there'll ever be another Russ Mobby, and there'll never be another Dottie Johnson. I think we need lots of people that have to fill that role collectively. You're never going to have that gathering again of the intellect, the charm, the understanding, the drive that the two of them brought together. And humility, I might add, because they would both disagree with that. But we all know it's true if we spent time with them. It's going to take more of us to push it. And I'm most optimistic about handing the baton when it's my turn to hand it. So what I'm seeing in the generation 35 and younger is an advocacy, a return to meaningful service that I think my generation missed. And they care deeply about direction and not about making a buck in the same way. So I've watched a lot of talented people under 35 give up successful, lucrative careers to engage in service or in community building. So I think the sector is in good hands moving forward. But again, it'll be collective. It's going to be different because of technology too. The round table is sometimes now a virtual round table. And that's something that's going to be more difficult to deal with. And it's a global roundtable. We can't just talk about Michigan anymore. And now, of course, you have the Community Foundation Ventures piece where we've merged some of the thinking around Ohio and Michigan and Illinois in that space. And that will continue to be part of the issue as we get smaller as a world because of technology. All those looking at philanthropy in the nonprofit sector and where it should move forward, I think you first have to, there are two key questions. What are our assets and what are our needs? And what made the 4 organizations in Michigan work was an understanding of both of those issues and then having leaders that push them. So I think in any part of the world where you're looking at philanthropic or nonprofit solutions, where are the assets and how do we get them to be part of the solution and how do we play? The other thing that has to happen is they need to find champions. And when I look at Dottie and Russ, they were champions for so many things and really zealots about moving those pieces forward. And without that, you can't move it forward. And again, this notion of momentum to vision to inclusion, it's dozens and dozens of small things that add up to the movement, not one big thing. And I certainly learned that from both Dottie and Russ. Oh yeah, Russ could run a meeting like nobody could run a meeting. What a unique set though. I mean, he was really a parliamentarian. Yeah. He grew up understanding parliamentary procedure and where that went. And I've never met anyone who could read a room like Russ Mobby. He can read the room, who's where, what their value system are, pull people in. If you went to a meeting, you couldn't sit quietly. He would find a way to pull you in and get your opinion. And I think it's because he sincerely valued everyone around the table. It was as much about moving an agenda forward as it was about value. And had it been just simply about an agenda, he wouldn't have been effective. But it's remarkable how he could synthesize the feelings, the direction, then set a tone at the end for next steps and push an agenda forward. And I have not seen anybody run a meeting like Russ. Dottie comes close, but he was the best.
Yeah, it's really good.
I think when you look at both CMF and M&A, which are the two things I'm closest to, it's not being static. It's being able to invent, reinvent, and be nimble, and not being afraid to take on some larger special projects and needs as they come forward, where others would shy away and say that's not core mission. But that whole notion of being flexible is critical. Both organizations evolved tremendously over their lifetime. They didn't just become that one thing. CMF's very different today than it was even 5 years ago, and M&A as well. And they'll continue to evolve. If they're the same 5 years from now, they probably will be stale and no longer useful. A guy named Terry Jarko, who ran junior achievement in St. Louis, and I was a kid when I met Terry as a sophomore in high school. And first real career coach too. Afterwards, I ended up working for junior achievement for years.
St. Louis, Michigan?
St. Louis, Missouri. I grew up in St. Louis. But Terry's the guy that you'd call and say, I have an issue, I'm trying to struggle through a dilemma. And Terry, by the end of the meeting, would always say the same thing. I don't know if I answered your questions or gave you more questions to answer. He would never tell you what to do. Would simply ask question after question after question. And had some remarkable statements that were a bit off color, but meaningful. Although using different words, he would say, if somebody's not angry at you, you're probably not doing your job. I fell into philanthropy. I think that's how we all get here.
Okay.
I don't think we wake up one day and say, I want to run a foundation. I was working at Junior Achievement in their national office, actually in a St. Louis regional office, which was then headquartered in Colorado Springs. So I would occasionally be in Colorado Springs. And Pete Ellis, who was a longtime program officer at the Kellogg Foundation, had recruited a big chunk of the professional staff there. And what Pete would do is he would go through his Rolodex of all of his grantees and call people up and say, this is the type of person we need, and you need to get one of yours on the inside. So Junior Achievement had a grant from Pete. And Pete had called out to Carl Flemke, the then national president of Junior Achievement. And he said, you need to get one of yours on the inside. And then you could say things that you wouldn't normally say, like the chairman is in his 60s and would be uncomfortable traveling with a woman, and so it probably should be a man. And it needs to be somebody who can write fairly well. And we'd prefer someone younger who can grow into leadership. And Carl Flemke called Marty Lee, head of human resources, who scratched his head and said, who in the world could fill this profile? And as he walked out of his office, scratching his head, I walked in the front door of the headquarters building, and he said, oh, you would fit. So if I had walked in the door 5 minutes later, I would have never made it to the Kellogg Foundation. So it was luck. Or divine intervention, depending on how you want to look at it.
Yeah. Had ever thought about?
No, as a matter of fact,
Profit, though, right?
right, Junior Achievement was not for profit, focused on business education. I actually said I didn't want to interview. I was in a field office in my 20s and was already rewriting the entire field ops manual with a couple of other people and how we were working. I was having the time of my life. And I had a boss at the time that basically drew a line in the sand and said, I don't want you to interview. If you do, you'll be out of a job. At which point I had to interview. So I'm also grateful that Pete Rowan drew a line in the sand. And after spending a day with Russ Mobby, I knew I needed to be in this business. Well, the philanthropy is transforming. I mean, where else in any other job do you have the opportunity to empower others to solve problems or to improve quality of life? The first thing I learned from Russ Mobby was, if you're in philanthropy, you really don't do anything, which was a bit of an overstatement. But what he was saying is, we're in the business of empowering others to do. And I found that to fit with my personal belief system in a big way, that if others could be empowered and charged forward, that we could make a lot more change than if you tried to do it alone or tried to solve a problem with a single solution. So I evolved at Russ's knee in many respects, watching him work, but started to understand as I watched philanthropy work, this role of empowerment, refocusing, asking questions, understanding multiple solutions were necessary. And it just seemed to stick. I'm not sure that I don't think it came from me. I think I copied it from Russ Mobby. I really do. I just saw it in him, and I so admired it. I wanted to have the same value system.
That hadn't been part of your upbringing?
No, I mean, my
necessarily?
family had always been involved with us as kids. You know, they supported what we were doing, and, you know, my dad drove the bus for the traveling basketball team to make it to the Nationals one year, and they served, but it wasn't the same level of empowerment and volunteerism and service that I saw after coming to Kellogg. I was really formed at the Kellogg Foundation as a professional. And Russ was important, and there were others there too. Joel Orosz was important. That incredible intellect, and to be able to free that in so many ways, and then to do it with such great wit as well in tough times. But Joel actually I went back to get an MBA at Kellogg, and I was a pretty lousy student as an undergrad. And Joel was the guy I would hand every term paper and every major paper and have him critique it. And he took the time to do that. I still remember him saying, "Your writing's improving a lot." That I don't think Joel knew it. That was one of the most important compliments I've ever received. So what a great writer. And so many others there too. I had been with Russ for over 3 years and had learned a great deal, and that you could tell the time was coming for him to make a transition, to bring another assistant on. This was a growth position and was meant to be that. It was never meant to be a job for life. And I could have gone into the foundation. I could have, there was a spot in education and youth programming that I was really looking at and trying to prepare myself for. And this M&A opportunity came along. And two things collided. One, the understanding that I had so closely modeled myself after some of Russ's value systems that if I stayed in the foundation, I would in some respects have been counterproductive. They didn't need me to do that work in that way. Also, I needed to move out from under my mentor's shadow so I could prove I could do it elsewhere. Doing it inside the system that I watched him build and adopting his practices from in many respects would have been stopping growth. I needed to move to the next challenge. And the Nonprofit Association was a bankrupt organization at the time. It was in the Michigan Nonprofit Forum. And Pete Ellis, who had recruited me, had actually set up for himself in retirement to run the Michigan Nonprofit Forum. And I stumbled across Pete's original notes for what he thought the forum should be. And on reading those, I just got it. He was absolutely spot on. So I saw a great challenge to go and take this thing that was bankrupt and try to turn it and put it back in place, the vision that Pete had for it, because it had gotten off track a bit. It was not pragmatic. It wasn't churning out the outcomes it should have. Sure, Pete had a notion that if you could bring the sector together around common issues, you could strengthen every element of the sector. So it was as much about convening people where the conferences and all the sessions came along, as well as educating people. So there was a whole other educational component. He wanted to drive out the whole newsletter and the publications pieces were things that Pete had put in place. And then he had envisioned the need for public policy, that there needed to be an ongoing effort to understand what was going to affect the sector, what threats there were and what opportunities there were, and to try to unite the sector as a whole around those issues. So that's what I set out to put in place, were really those three pieces. So as president of the Hudson Weber Foundation, the focus of the foundation since 1939 has been quality of life in the city of Detroit. A pretty wide splotch to cover. And we did incredible work under the leadership of Gil Hudson in seeding Midtown Detroit in its kind of rebirth. And that continues. But what we saw, there was some data that drove the foundation in a little different direction. Michigan was losing disproportionately its young, talented population. So if Detroit looked like Chicago, same proportion of the population were under 35 with a college degree as the same proportion of Metro Chicago, there'd be 136,000 under 35 college educated in the city of Detroit. If Detroit looked like Minneapolis, St. Paul, there'd be 82,000 under 35 with a college degree. Detroit has 15,000 total. And so the natural conclusion is to say, well, the out-migration caused all the young talent to go to the suburbs. And that's incorrect as well. The suburbs are half as dense with that cohort of under 35 college educated as Chicago and Minneapolis, St. Paul. So the bottom line is, if we don't get younger and better educated, attracting, retaining, and creating our own talent, the city can't survive, the region can't survive, and I would say the state can't survive. So we didn't shift our focus as much as sharpen it. We're now setting out to try to attract 15,000 under 35 college educated to greater downtown by 2015. Why those numbers? One, they sound awfully good. We needed a vision and a rallying cry. And two, it's doubling the current number and densifying it. So we think it's a tipping point. We never intended this to be a program of Hudson Weber. It's a vision that we tried to sell to multiple people and have great ownership. So we started with 3 key anchor institutions in Midtown Detroit: Wayne State University, Henry Ford Health Systems, and Detroit Medical Center, who are now working together on talent attraction and economic development. And I knew we had succeeded when the governor in his first state of the state mentioned those 3 institutions in 1515, and there was no mention of Hudson Weber. We don't want there to be a mention of Hudson Weber. This has to be a vision that everyone is inspired to share. So those values that I learned under Russ and Kellogg transferred, empower the others, inspire a shared vision, then seed opportunity. So we've gone about that in that manner. A lot of dinner meetings, a lot of pushing forward. I had the privilege of hosting the first ever meeting, the first meeting in 40 years of the president of the DMC and Wayne State that wasn't about the medical school, where they had fought for years. So a trick from Russ Mobby, quiet dinner with the 3 of us, and we spent the first 45 minutes discussing very lofty, difficult issues, coaching soccer, where they could find a common way to work together. And by the end of the dinner, they said to each other, we should be able to fight like hell about the medical school and still do this other work. So they got themselves there. So that's been the Hudson Weber work. It's been the place building, place making, and creating the shared vision to bring young talent back to the city. The new economy work has been focused on trying to reinvigorate the economy, accelerate its transition to be more innovative. And when I took that over, I think it's important to note 10 funders came together with $100 million and frankly didn't know what they were going to do with it. It was a leap of faith that if they put their money together, they could make a difference. But there was no plan. So we stumbled along a bit trying to find the plan and had numbers of meetings. And I actually stepped in just short of 2 years into the project. And John Austin was the first director there and had done a great job of kind of gearing up data. But the foundations weren't pushing out an implementation strategy in the way they should. So we focused on the incredible assets that gave us comparable advantage and understanding where those could drive the economy, creating a robust employment workforce, and then creating an entrepreneurial ecosystem that could grow any business that's in place or any new entrepreneur. And we found the greatest success in the last one. So we're now doubling down in that space. We're putting more money into this entrepreneurial ecosystem. If we can grow our own. And entrepreneur is a word that's misunderstood. It was actually first coined by an 18th century Irish economist. And the definition says nothing about business or profit. His definition was it's a person that takes full responsibility for a success or failure of an initiative or an ideal. So under that definition, Martin Luther King Jr. is no less an entrepreneur than Bill Gates, because it's about pursuing this kind of focus, this outcome. And don't we need more entrepreneurial school teachers and firefighters and city officials and you name it?
Nonprofit leaders?
Nonprofit leaders would fall into that category as well. So the NEI work has been focused very much on this, creating an ecosystem that can produce more entrepreneurs. I think my unique role is a connector. So can you connect people that together can make a difference. And the great privilege of playing that role is and I think, again, this goes back to Russ Mobby and what I learned from Russ. Being able to see how people can contribute to each other's success, and where someone may have the missing ingredient to the recipe to make something work, and trying to just connect them into the mix and bring them along. The other great thing about being a connector is once you do your work and you've got them working together and empowered and moving, you don't need to be there. So I think it's best that connectors be only visible when they're needed and then fall into the shadows. I think the core of the work of Hudson Weber and NEI is to get movement with lots of people, but take very little credit for it. Those people need to push the initiatives forward. And I think the minute we start thumping our chest about it, we've done something wrong. Success has many parents and failure is an orphan. So we need to keep giving credit, not taking it. My work, I'm a funder. And so the bottom line is the work's done by people who we fund. And while we might be helpful and might make connections, I don't think we can take full credit for what they do. We'll get credit. People will know where we were, but we shouldn't seek it. I'm convinced of that. I'm also convinced we give away our power if we try to, that the real power is in connecting and slowly fading into the background. Get far more done if you don't care who gets credit for the outcomes than if you insist upon getting credit. I have a vision for the work I'm doing, and I don't know what's next. I'm really taken by the incredible place we live that people overlook. You know, we're in Southeast Michigan and Michigan in general, we are the victims of our own success. If you look back 100 years ago, Detroit, Grand Rapids, Battle Creek, all had their own innovations growing. You know, we were the equivalent of Silicon Valley. If you wanted to make it, you came here. If you had an idea, you came here and connected. Henry Ford launched numerous entrepreneurs that he needed to build pieces and parts and components and tires for the automobile. And so this was an innovative place. And over a 70-year period, we started to depend on the paternal relationship we had formed with large corporations. And that it seemed to drain the entrepreneurial spirit out of us. The question is there still an entrepreneurial gene in our DNA? And if so, has it become dormant? And we found that it's still there and it needs to be stimulated. So you've got this great history and then this incredible set of assets around us. We're surrounded by 20% of the world's freshwater supply. The largest manufacturing capacity in the world is still here in Michigan. Southeast Michigan has the 6th largest creative class in North America. There are 3 Tier 1 research universities that move from the middle of the state to Southeast Michigan that take in almost just under $2 billion of public dollars in research annually. They're within 75 miles of one another. The best developed community college system in the country sits here. The best development community foundation system in the country sits here. We've got, if you take a look at the north, you've got these incredible hardwood pines. You're virtually just a few hours drive at the most from skiing or the ocean without salt in any one of the Great Lakes. Incredible resources that we take for granted. Arts and cultural institutions that rival those in the world. Some of the best. I just came back from a trip to Europe, and the DIA stands up to any of the museums I looked at there. Symphonies on both sides of the state. This is an incredible place to live. And unfortunately, we have defined ourselves over the years by our deficits, not our assets. And if we would start defining ourselves by our assets, we could make a big difference. We could turn a lot faster. The nonprofit sector fills out the equation inside of Michigan. So you've got the public sector whose role is very well defined. And if you look at these issues of assets and growth, they have to make public investments in universities and in public spaces, and that will drive people here and drive innovation. If you look at the for-profit sector, they need to make money. That drives everything else. Philanthropy is a beneficiary of the success of a number of great entrepreneurs and business people. And so the private sector isn't working, nothing works, because there's no tax money and there's no philanthropic money. But without the nonprofit sector, you can't complete the story that the universities are nonprofit, the healthcare systems are nonprofit, our library system is nonprofit, arts and culture, nonprofit. It's the fabric of civil society that would be lost if we didn't invest in it. And if we think we can have a successful society and a successful Michigan with just a flourishing public and private sector, and leave out that fabric of life, the whole kind of meaning of life, Parks and Rec system as well. If you leave that out of the system, the equation, who would want to live here? I don't want to live in a state without culture. I don't want to live in a state without Parks and Rec and working systems. And that's what the nonprofit sector does.